Hello, friends, and welcome again to Harvest of Hope. I am Minister Pedro Diaz, and if this is your first time listening, I pray this message encourages your soul and challenges your heart. Today, we bring you part six of our series, drawn from the iron statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. These declarations, they open up the person and presence of Jesus, not only in history, but in the lives of all who trust Him. So today we turn to the words he spoke at a moment of sorrow and deep loss. But before we look at his words, let me begin with a story. There's an ancient custom in many cultures of sitting with the dead for days after they have passed. And in Jewish tradition, it was believed that the soul lingered near the body for up to 3 days. But after the fourth day, all hope was lost. That fourth day meant finality. It meant that the time for miracles had passed. And that's where we meet Jesus. Not just near the tomb of Lazarus, but in the thick cloud of finality. John chapter 11, verse 25 records this powerful statement. Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. These words were whispered to a grieving sister, whose brother had been dead for 4 days. They came not during celebration, but when everything seemed lost. And let's remember the setting, Lazarus was a close friend of Jesus, as were his sisters, Mary and Martha. News of Lazarus' sickness had reached, Jesus, but instead of him coming immediately, he waited. And this delay wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. you know as Augustine wrote, Christ delay that he may raise him when he had been 4 days dead. For his delay, not because he could not heal, but because he desired to do something greater. That fourth day is critical. In first century Jewish belief, as recorded in the writings of Rabbi Eliezer Zadok, the soul was thought to hover over the body for 3 days, hoping to return. After the third day, decay began and return was considered impossible. Jesus chose to arrive at that moment to show that his power wasn't confined by superstition or timelines. When Martha meets Jesus, she's honest. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Her faith had limits. You know, it trusted in what could have been, but not yet in what still could be. Jesus didn't scold her. He responded with truth that reached beyond her pain. Your brother will rise again. Martha, shaped by teachings of a distant resurrection at the time, agreed. But then Jesus redirected her gaze, not a doctrine, but to himself. He didn't say resurrection was coming. He said resurrection had arrived. And it had arrived in him. And historian N.T. Wright points out that this isn't merely a future hope. It's a present claim. Jesus isn't just promising, life after death. He's declaring that the power of life itself stands in front of her now. This changes everything. Jesus didn't need to wait for another era or call on another force. What others believe was bound to the end of time, he brought into the middle of history, and he brought it face to face with grief. The miracle that follows, the rising of Lazarus, is a sign, not just a rescue. It shows that life, in its truest sense, obeys Christ. Death yields to him. It is not simply that Lazarus came back, it's that life answered when Jesus called. What does this means for us? It means that Jesus doesn't only deal in eternity, he meets us in the final hours, in the fourth day of our lives, when hope seems irretrievable, when healing feels too late, when nothing can be reversed. He steps into those spaces not as a reminder of past powers, but as the present source of life. The 20th century scholar Karl Barth, once said that The gospel is not a truth among other truths, rather it sets a question marks against all truth. The truth that death ends everything in is one such claim, and Jesus questions it, not with denial, but with defiance. Throughout history, resurrection was viewed as God's final act. But here, Jesus reveals that the life giving, works of God is not postponed to the end of times. It is already breaking in. As Swiss scholar Edward Schweitzer notes, eternal life does not begin after death. It begins in relationship with Christ. This doesn't remove grief. Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb. Those tears weren't for show. They were real. Even knowing what was about to happen, he grieved with those who mourn. This shows us something profound. Resurrection power doesn't bypass sorrow. It enters into it. In that we find comfort. Christianity it's not about escaping reality. It's about Christ entering so fully that even death cannot keep him out. And when he speaks, even graves respond. you know Today, brothers and sisters, many live surrounded by reminders of loss. Whether it is the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, the collapse of plans, or the decay of hope. These are the tombs we walk beside each day. We wonder, like Martha did, where God is. We wonder, like Mary, why he delayed. But the answer isn't found in timelines. It is found in presence. He comes late by human reckoning, but always on time for what only he can do. you know Lazarus, he walked out of the tomb not because death had forgotten him, but because Jesus had not. And that same voice speaks still, not always to reverse every loss, but to awaken what is not yet gone. you know Church, father, Irenaeus, wrote, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. This is what Christ restores, life that is full, unchained, unshadowed by fear, not a borrowed life, but one drawn from the source. This this power is not confined to graves. It is for a place where hope was, where hope has died, for every heart that shuts down, for every soul that thinks it's too late. Christ's life is not a reward, it's a gift. Not someday, but today. That is the gift he gives us. We are not told what Lazarus experienced in those 4 days, but we are told that when Jesus called, he came. He tells us something crucial. No situation is too far gone. No story is too close. When Jesus calls, life answers us. This is the hope of the gospel. It is not wishful thinking. It is anchored in a person who conquered death, not just for himself, but for all who believe. You know, there was this poet, named George Herbert, that once said death used to be an executioner, but the gospel had made him just a gardener. In other words, what once ended everything, only plants the seeds for something greater. That is the assurance Jesus gives Martha. Not that sorrow will never come, but that sorrow does not get the final say. Let's hold on to this. Jesus didn't ask Martha to understand resurrection. He asked her to trust him. The same question comes to us daily. Not do you understand what happens after death, but do you believe in the one who holds life? And belief here is not it's not a mental agreement. It is a leaning. It's a leaning into, a resting upon. Is Martha's confession? Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, that the Son of God. Her belief came, before the miracle. That's what faith often is. Trusting God before the stone is rolled away. In this moment, we are reminded that faith doesn't eliminate the sting of death, but it does silence its final word, and Jesus speaks louder still. He doesn't remove the the tomb in our lives by force. He calls us out of them. And when he does, we are invited to walk. Still wrapped in grave clothes, maybe, still blinking at the light, but alive. So how do we respond? Not with passive hope, but with active trust, to believe that the same voice that called Lazarus now calls us to come alive, even in places where we're settled for decay. The resurrection is not only something we celebrate once a year. It is the reason we get up again. It is the strength to forgive, to endure, to hope, to love in the face of whatever seems finished. And even when death comes, it is not the end. you know it is not the end. This is the end for me, the beginning of life. We carry that assurance, not as a theory, but as a truth that has touched the grave and emerged with scars and life both intact. And so I ask you, where do you need resurrection? What part of your soul has accepted the stone as permanent? Hear again the voice of Christ, not just in history, but here, here and now. He does not promise, we will avoid the valley. He promises to walk with us through it. And in his presence, even shadows give way to light. So let these words be more than history. Let them be hope. Let them echo not just in the tomb of Lazarus, but in every place where life is needed. you know so, brothers and sisters, thank you for joining us today, and may the one who called life from the grave speak to your spirit even now. And may you carry this assurance in your bones, not as borrowed faith, but as your own. These are truth unshaken. God bless you all.